regard to trying to understand Mary, especially the Mary in the scriptures, or Mary, the role and place of Mary in the church, it's undeniable that Mary is the most powerful and most popular figure of veneration in the Christian tradition. In fact, Marian devotion is central in the Catholic Church as well as in the Eastern Orthodox traditions. And in this context, I would like to refer to what Pope Francis has said in Evangelii Gaudium regarding the evangelizing power of popular piety. And in reference to this, Benedict XVI also says that popular piety is a precious treasure of the Catholic Church. Now, if we want to retrieve this evangelizing power of popular piety, especially in the context of Mary, I would say that what we need to do is to retrieve the Mary of the Gospels. And I somehow like what Pope Francis talks about, the evangelizing power. And since Mary is such a popular and powerful figure of veneration, this is what we've got to retrieve, the Mary of the Gospels, so that we can truly understand who she is as a woman of the Gospels, as a person specially chosen by God, who has played such a significant role in God's plan of salvation. And in order to rediscover this evangelizing power of Marian piety or Marian devotion, I think what we need is a paradigm shift in understanding who she is and her role. And this paradigm shift entails a shift from the domesticated and romanticized Mary that we have grown to associate her with, and this is because of various socio-historical factors and also the changes that have taken place in the self-understanding of the Church, which has also affected the understanding of who Mary is. We need this shift from this domesticated Mary to the dynamic woman that she is in God's salvific plan, the committed disciple of Mary, the committed discipleship of Mary, especially in her relationship with Jesus. We also need a paradigm shift from the popular Marian piety and devotion to popular Marian spirituality, to people's mysticism, Marian people's mysticism, which goes along with what Pope Francis speaks about in Evangelii Gaudium. Now, to retrieve this understanding, in order to make this kind of a paradigm shift, what we need is also to understand Mary from an interdisciplinary perspective. And this has been given to us at Vatican II in Chapter 8 of Lumen Gentium, to rediscover Mary from the Christological, biblical, ecclesiological, ecumenical, and pastoral, and also above all anthropological perspectives. And only if we try to understand Mary from this interdisciplinary perspective, I think we will be able to understand who she is in the Gospels and the role that she has played in God's plan of salvation. The second thing what we need to do is, in order to make this paradigm shift, is also rereading of Marian dogmas and doctrines and resituating them within the framework of Mary's dynamic participation in God's work, especially in His salvific work for the human and cosmic world. In fact, in Marialis Cultus, it is Pope Paul VI who says that we need to go back to to understand who Mary is, we've got to retrieve Mary or relate Mary rather to the origin and effectiveness from Christ. That is, any devotion to Mary must have its origin and effectiveness from Christ. Even any expression in relation to devotion to Mary must begin with Christ. And this is the Christological dimension that devotions to Mary must be rediscovered. Now, we know when we go back to the Gospels, we have very few texts in the Gospels concerning Mary, but there are enough, more than enough, to understand who she is. And all the four Gospels present her first and foremost as an ordinary woman, an ordinary Jewish Palestinian woman, simple, coming from the town of Nazareth, another insignificant town, but it does not deny the fact that she was a historical woman. And from this insignificant background, the Gospels also present her as a woman of faith, especially for her openness, her receptivity, and her participation to fulfill God's plan of salvation. She is also presented in the Gospels as a woman of courage. And this is something very outstanding about her because of the way she accepted to be the mother of Jesus, and particularly in the context of all the implications in relation to Mary's motherhood, what her motherhood implied, not only in relation to Mary, but also from the human context, the anthropological context of being a mother, especially in the context of the first century Palestinian world. And thirdly, also the Gospels present her as a woman of inner strength. This is something also very remarkable about her, especially in the context of her encounters with the trials and difficulties and the challenges that she had to face, all the sufferings. She was 100% a woman, 100% a human being, and she did go through all these sufferings and trials. Again, in the context of her motherhood, in the context of her relationship with Jesus, in the context of her relationship with Jesus' kingdom mission as well, how she comes across as a woman of inner strength. And in this area, Pope Paul VI in Marialis Curtus affirms what is given to us in the Gospels and refers to her as our sister. If she is a woman of courage, a woman of inner strength, an ordinary woman, a woman of faith, she vibes with us more as our sister, rather than placing her on a kind of a pedestal and looking at her as some kind of sometimes even the tendency to look at her as a kind of a goddess. But since she was human, she was a woman in every aspect, she comes across to us also as our sister. That becomes very inspirational for us, somebody whom we can imitate, somebody whom we can look up to, someone who's one with humanity, one with human beings, one with men and women. In this sense, she exemplifies the power of womanhood. And because of this, I would say that there are times when we have dehydrated Mary, associating her with very passive virtues, that she was meek, mild, humble, always did God's will, but passively. But when we try to really understand all the scriptural texts using the exegetical and hermeneutical methods to reread these texts, she does come across as a woman of power. The power of womanhood is brought out very significantly. And this also expresses the spirituality of womanhood, the spirituality of humanhood. Coming to another area concerning Mary is what the Gospels and the doctrines have to say about Mary. How do they present Mary, apart from what I've already said? Those Gospels and doctrines also present Mary as a disciple, as a type of the church. And in this context, I find it very meaningful, especially when we want someone to look up to, especially in today's context, what it is to be church, who is the church. I think Mary gives a very good example of what it is to be a disciple, and above all, who is a disciple. Because first and foremost, she was a model of the Anavim. We can call her an Anavim herself. Someone who always trusted in God, who was God-centered, who depended on God totally for everything and every moment of her life, especially to fulfill God's will, to fulfill His plan for her. And there she comes across as the perfect Anavim, as someone who always trusted and who always depended on God. And in the context of a discipleship, she's also presented both by the gospel and the scripture as well as the doctrines as a woman of the Beatitudes. And if you really analyze the Beatitudes in the context of Mary's life, you can see that she lived the Beatitudes in every sense of the word. Right from the understanding of blessed are those who are poor, blessed are those who are meek, blessed are those who are pure in heart. All that is indicative of how she lived her life. Pure in heart was nothing but how she was always in communion with God, always wanting to do His will, always receptive to God's word. Even blessed are those who are compassionate or merciful. You see that in Mary's life too. She was merciful and compassionate in the Cana event, as well as when she visited Elizabeth. She also comes across as a woman who shared in the sufferings of people when she herself went through sufferings at Calvary. So if we look at the Beatitude and apply it to her life, we can truly say that with regard to her discipleship, she was truly a woman of the Beatitudes. And in connection with the Beatitudes and her discipleship, she was also a woman of the Magnificat. Someone who was always on the side of the poor, and which would go very well with the understanding of the church that Pope Francis speaks about, a poor church for the poor. And Mary of the Magnificat exemplifies that. Because the very fact that Luke has applied it to Mary's life, the triple revolution that we find in the Beatitudes, namely the economic, the moral and the political revolution, you find that exemplified in her life as well, where she always sided with the poor. In this context also, when you talk about the poor here would mean, in our context today, is the periphery, those who are in the periphery, the marginalized, the poorest of the poor, the forgotten, the ones who are just not thought of, especially in the context of the culture of forgetfulness that we are in, the consumeristic culture, the speed culture that qualifies the context of the world today, the contemporary world. In this sense, we see Mary as one who is always present, who is present to those who are in the periphery. And I think that Mary of the Magnificat explains that very well. And thirdly, I would also look at, or as a fourth point with regard to this point of discipleship, is she is also a woman of solitude. And this is in the Gospel that presents her as a pondering woman. And this pondering woman is not one who was passively silent, but someone who enjoyed being in the presence of God in silence, in solitude. And this was her God experience in silence and solitude. And I would say that this is also the spirituality that Mary expresses, and which is very meaningful for us today, because in our fast-moving world, in our context of noise, we are always searching for some quiet, searching for meaningfulness, searching for God. And I think Mary gives us a very good example of this a woman who sought God in silence, in solitude. And therefore, in this context, I would like to sum up, again going back to Pope Francis when he talks about the popular spirituality or people's mysticism. I would say that the popular spirituality or people's mysticism is very well manifested in Mary, especially in the Navam spirituality, in the spirituality of her silence and solitude, and also in the spirituality of how she lived the Beatitudes. And in this we can say, we can discover the evangelizing power in her, because she sets an example for us, not merely to someone whom we admire, but someone whom we can imitate, someone who's a model for us of how to be church today, especially in the present context, because it's a big challenge for us of how to be church, how to be a disciple of Jesus. And Mary of the Gospels gives us this example of how to be. And therefore I would say that she's not only an example for women, she's not only a kind of model for women, no doubt. She's someone who's inspiring us of how to retrieve the dignity of womanhood. But through this dignity of womanhood, she's also giving us, she's also manifesting something more important, and that is the sacredness of humanhood, of humanity, of life. And any devotion to Mary or any teachings on Mary, and I would go especially back to Mary of the Gospels, exemplifies this particular aspect of how she's an embodiment of life, an embodiment of her deep experience with God, an embodiment of discipleship.